Today's lecture is going to focus on the topic of shaping mass media. And what we're going to really do is lay the groundwork for some of the foundational concepts that we need to understand when it comes to mass media, mass communication, and of course, media theory. So to begin understanding media theory, the first thing we need to do is really acknowledge the origins and development of contemporary mass media. It's very much understanding our past to understand our future, and also to give us a clear context to why mass communication is the way it is today. And your textbook does a great job of giving this historical context that really shows how mass media was shaped for us in the United States, but also globally. So let's start with some important definitions for this lecture. First, mass communication. This is a generic definition. We'll get into deeper definitions of what mass comm is, but for our purposes this lecture, this is ultimately communication that happens on a large scale to a wide audience. So when we talk about mass communication, it's right there in the name. It's communication to the masses. So we're talking about our messaging going out to a large group of people. Then we have interpersonal communication. These are two or more interdependent people who communicate with one another through verbal and nonverbal messaging. And it's important to note that when we talk about interpersonal communication, more often than not, we think of face-to-face communication. And that's probably the primary example of interpersonal communication, but there are other modes of communication where interpersonal communication can happen. This includes the telephone. This includes any sort of audio conferencing software where we're still able to pick up those verbal and nonverbal messages. Then we have mediated or mass personal communication, and this is when people or groups of people communicate through technology. Understanding what mediated communication is going to be especially important for this course because much of what we're talking about as it relates to mass communication is mediated communication, is communication that's going to happen through multimedia, through different technologies, through different softwares. So your textbook gives us some good historical context about early mass communication in American society. So it really marks the beginning of this journey with the journey of the Mayflower to New Plymouth. And it focuses on the description of what the early settlers' lives looked like. It was a significant amount of work, it was brutal conditions, and it had very limited communication. And that's because media presence was also extremely limited. There was a significant reliance on interpersonal communication or personal conversations, and one of the most popular printed materials available was the Bible. In addition to that, literacy rates were incredibly low and access to general reading materials was very, very limited. So we're talking about a society that really focused on interpersonal communication, word of mouth, to transmit stories and to get information passed along. Now, the development of mass media, this is a great contrast to what we've seen in the early settlers' lives as we look at today's media landscape. And this is something that actually happened quite rapidly. We've seen over time how we've evolved from just the written word to movable type to being able to mass publish with the Gutenberg Press. Now we've got these digital technologies that really make us accessible 24/7. That means for us, compared to early settlers, we are constantly exposed to mass messaging and we have constant access to mass media. So this really is reflected in the instant availability of mass communication content, whether that's through the medium of TV, internet, social media, podcasts, and more. The reality is that we have a truly diverse set of tools to communicate with, and then certainly the increased literacy rates and accessibility of the written word is much greater now. So how do we define media today? We know that the landscape of media is changing rapidly and has grown quickly. When we talk about old media, we're typically talking about media that is synchronous, which means, you have to read it at a certain time. It's got a limited purview. It's passive, which means you read and that's about as much participation as there is, or you observe and that's about as much participation as there is. It was still focused on a mass audience, so it really was trying to blanket to everyone. And it was divergent. Each of these media happened separately. In new media, or the reality of the landscape today, we see it as asynchronous, which means people access it at any time. It's constantly available. And then there's a level of interaction, whether that's the ability to comment on a news article, to rewind, to like, to share. We have a more interactive nature of media today, which means we are much more participative. Additionally, the targeting is much more narrow casted. We now have the ability to truly tailor messaging to specific audiences based on their wants, needs, and oftentimes we can tailor this with things as specific as demographics or psychographics. And then last, media is now convergent. That means all of these different media types work together. You may read a news article that has embedded video. We see social media posts that have embedded photography, imagery, GIFs. It is much more blended of an approach when it comes to media now. And what this really means is that we as media consumers are much more used to this diverse media set and we crave it. Our attention spans crave it. And it also means for us as communicators that we have a responsibility to be able to message in these diverse ways. So when it comes to mass media and society, what we really need to recognize is that there is an interrelationship between mass media and society, and there's clear impacts from the media on how our society operates. Because mass media is so deeply integrated with the larger context of American society, I mean, we have amendments that surround our access to media. That means that there's continuous change within both society and mass media over time because they influence one another. So that means for us as communicators and those who are studying mass media theories, we are going to be able to better understand why American society is the way it is right now because we can understand the influence that the media has. And your textbook does a great job of framing some critical questions about the U.S. media system. So things we should consider as we're observing the evolution of mass media is how did the U.S. develop its current complex mass communication system? Certainly we see the influence of social and cultural factors, things like changing societal values, changing and shifting cultural values, more diverse cultures participating in the media, more diverse perspectives participating in the media. And then, of course, we see factors like free enterprise, competition, profit and motive, and private ownership affect our media as well. This is a reflection of the fact that we live in a capitalistic society, and because of that, it is very clear that our American media system is going to be monetized. And then last, there's limited government control over our media content. In fact, we have amendments that protect our right and access to this media. And then in last point here, comparison with other nations, we do see significant differences in mass communication systems worldwide. Many foreign countries have much more control from their government over their communication systems. And this ranges from as free as the American system to as strict as, say, the Chinese government, who significantly monitors their news systems. So those historical and cultural influences on U.S. media are significant. Ultimately, the mass media system is a product of the nation's history and culture, and this is reflected in every country, not just the United States. We also see the impact of technological advancements on mass media, particularly the integration of multimedia. And we see this has varied applications in different societies depending on their own societal and cultural values. So when we try to understand media in context, what we're really weighing is what sort of social, political, economic, and cultural influences have impacted and affected our mass media systems more than just technology alone. Because really, our mass media exists in the context of all of these different factors, and the state that it's in right now is certainly a reflection of those concepts. So when we talk about the core cultural values that shape U.S. media, what we're really looking at are these political, economic, moral, and legal norms that stem from our own cultural values as Americans, and that's going to influence the media system. In addition to that, we've seen that historical events also shaped media development and the continuous influence of historical experiences on the evolving mass communication system. Next, I'd like to talk about media literacy. Media literacy is going to be something that's significant in this course as we break down, analyze, and apply the media theories. So first, what we need to understand about media literacy is that all media messages are constructed. That means that any messaging is created by a person, and recognizing that media texts are built is key in understanding the intentions, the influence, and the impact of media messaging. We need to recognize that no media is real, but that all media is created, and it has been created with an intention or purpose. And it's up to us to assess who built them and what they're intending to do with it. So once we start to recognize that media messages are constructed using a creative language with its own rules, we can really start to understand how media impacts society. So we need to recognize that media uses common structures to gain and maintain our attention. It's going to use things it knows will capture or hold or engage with our attention spans. And this often means using things like clickbait or surprise factors or really crazy headlines to draw us in because they know that's what's going to hold our attention. If we can understand these structures, what they're trying to do here, then we can try to avoid the negative effects that the media might have on us. We also need to recognize that different people experience the same media messages differently. Because the message is encoded by a person and then decoded by a person, it is open to interpretation because ultimately people create meaning, both the creators and the consumers. So not only is the person who encodes the message influencing it in some way, the person who decodes the message is also going to apply their own experiences, their own perspectives to that message, which means that they are going to interpret it in a unique way as well. We can learn to be more critical consumers of media just by reflecting on the perceptions of our messaging. We also need to recognize that the media have embedded values and point of views. And what this means is that oftentimes the media we consume is not objective. It's been designed with a specific purpose, a specific value behind it. Ultimately, the media are storytellers. They are trying to tell you and oftentimes sell you a story. And it's up to us as communicators to craft these stories. Content creators bring their values and point of view to their stories because inadvertently that's just what we do. We have a specific perspective, and it's very difficult for that perspective not to influence the message we create. So we must learn to read media for the point of view that's there and any point of views that are left out. So there could be missing context, there could be missing dimensions to understanding that information. It's our responsibility to find those additional perspectives. And then the last part of media literacy is that most messages are organized to gain profit and or power, if not one or the other, oftentimes both. And this is key because when we talk about traditional media, that truly is their main motivation. The purpose of media is to create an audience because an audience equals money. It equals consumers. So the more audience members, the better because we've found ways to monetize this messaging. Media is a powerful tool for persuasion. It's influential. That means it can change behavior, attitudes, thoughts, just through the dissemination of information. So when you're being critical of these messages that are looking for you to become a consumer or to gain power over you, you need to try to understand, why is this message being sent? What is it trying to motivate me to do? Who does this message benefit? And then what factors influence the message? What sort of point of views? What sort of context? What sort of key things or perspectives could really cause this message to be misinterpreted or interpreted in a certain way? Last, we're going to talk about media ethics, and probably every one of your communication courses has talked about ethics, and that's because we as communicators have a significant responsibility to work ethically. You just saw how influential the media can be and the power it has, and that means if we are going to have this power, we need to use it ethically. So ultimately, ethics is just what is right and what is wrong for society. And there's a lot of things that can influence our own personal ethical codes and moral standards, but many industries also have their own ethical codes that are specific to industries. It is important to note that ethics are not the same as your feelings, your religion, the law, culturally accepted norms, or science. Oftentimes, we might use these things to influence how we make ethical decisions, but ethics itself is deciding what is right and what is wrong when faced with a tough decision. And philosophy will show you that there's many different ways to approach ethical decision making. There's many different ethical lenses that we can explore or use to influence our ethical decision making. So first we have the rights lens, which includes the different rights we assume as ethical decision makers: the right to free choice, the right to truth, the right of privacy, the right to not be harmed, and the right to do what is agreed. And this says that these are inalienable rights that we have or should have access to as U.S. citizens, and that should influence how we act ethically. Then we have the justice lens, and this looks at different types of justice and how it influences the systems, including our own behaviors. So we have social justice, we have distributive justice, corrective justice, retributive justice, and restorative justice. And these all look at the different approaches to achieving justice. So social justice is going to look at grassroots initiatives that bring change to society. Distributive justice is going to focus on the balance of power and punishment. Corrective justice is going to look at making amendments and changes that will rectify a unjust situation. Retributive justice is what we think of as like punitive justice. And then restorative justice is restoring rights or access to something that was previously prohibited. Other ethical lenses include the utilitarian lens. This is an emphasis on the consequences of actions, and that ethical actions are the ones that produce the greatest good for the most people. So it looks at the idea that while some may be harmed, as long as it's beneficial for the greater majority, that's utilitarian. Then we have the common good lens. This is an emphasis on common values and goals for all members of a community. It really focuses on the benefit to society. And like I said, philosophy loves to talk about ethics. These are some other lenses we can observe ethics through. The focus on human ideals and reflecting on the type of person we want to become is the virtue lens. And there's a lot of things that fall into that virtue category. It includes honesty, courage, compassion, generosity, tolerance, love, integrity. And what it ultimately states is that your actions reflect your virtues, and that is ethical. Then we have the care ethics lens. This focuses on relationships and the interdependent nature of people. It really stresses empathy and active listening. And all ethical actions from this lens will happen through our relationship concerns and feelings of all of those involved in finding compromises between us and the interdependent people we care about. So the key takeaways from today's lecture and chapter 1 of your textbook include, first, understanding the importance of the cultural and historical foundations on media, particularly in American society, and then understanding how media's role shapes work, leisure, ideas, and society as a whole. We also need to understand the roots of U.S. mass communication as it continues to evolve, and also just appreciate how rapidly it is growing and changing. We also need to recognize that media literacy is especially important in today's evolving world, particularly when we start to talk about the challenges of AI. And then last, the importance of media ethics and ethical decision making as communicators, because ultimately we have influence over society and we need to use it responsibly. If you have any questions about today's lecture or what you read in chapter 1, please feel free to email me.